Shazam!
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 Shazam.
It's fun to say, Shazam.
Shazam!
Shazam is Superman plus magic.
They hit on a really good formula of a young, powerless boy who has this magic word and suddenly is bulletproof, and he can fly.
That could let anybody reading the book, any kid, imagine that they are the hero.
It's the wish of an adolescent to be an adult. It's the wish of a mere mortal to be a superhero.
He's got super strength. I mean, he could pick up a building.
He's just an incredibly awesome character.
Shazam was way ahead of its time. There was an elegance to it, power. It just entranced me.
I don't remember a time I didn't know who Shazam was. And he's had black and white serials, TV shows, a cartoon series.
In the 40s, he was bigger than Superman.
It was Superman versus Shazam, the two premier superheroes of the golden age of comics. Shazam was a massive threat to DC and to Superman, but he was better than Superman.
When they created Shazam, they couldn't have imagined the journey that character was going on.
Shazam?
Believe it or not, in the early days of comics' golden age, a superhero reigned who was more popular than DC Comics' biggest stars. Originally, he was called Captain Marvel, but today he is simply known as Shazam! And his story starts here in New York City. The year was 1940. Back then, if you were a kid, you probably spent your hard-earned nickels on Superman, the breakout star of National Comics publications, later known as DC Comics. Superman represented the heroism Americans looked for during the Great Depression. Naturally, his popularity inspired a flood of imitators. And although most Superman wannabes were failures, one DC rival, Fawcett Publications, was about to capture lightning in a bottle.
Fawcett Publications was a longtime publisher going back to 1919. They were in the magazine and trade paperback business.
They take a look at the other trends in publishing. And the biggest thing is comic books. This is a huge market that they need to be a part of. So from scratch, they start an entire comic book division.
That's what the comic book field is all about. Somebody does something and somebody else goes, that looks good, let's do that.
To create their first superhero, Fawcett turned to two staff employees, an eccentric but brilliant pulp magazine artist, C.C. Beck, and an ex-sports writer turned editor named Bill Parker. At the time, Parker was a member of the New York National Guard, and his time with that reserve military service gave him an idea. His new creation would be called a captain.
Parker came up with the idea of Captain Marvel, but the original plan was to feature more of a team. Each one would have specific feats of power and strength.
But when he pitched this idea, which was really in many ways based on the Knights of the Round Table, he was told, it's too complicated. How about instead of a bunch of people, this captain has all of the same powers just as a single person?
And then they looked at famous actors of the time, Errol Flynn and Fred McMurray and Cary Grant, for reference for the character.
So, Captain Marvel was born, and in early 1940, Parker and Beck's creation was ready to meet the public. In the pages of the magazine Whiz Comics, #2.
The #2 is because at first they weren't sure if they needed to count the ashcan editions that they had produced. Eventually, for copyright purposes, this became the new #1. What an ashcan is, the best analogy I can give you is domain name squatting for Golden Age comic books. It was a way for comic book companies to register the trademark title. At first, before you had characters like Captain Marvel and Superman selling comic books, everyone thought it was the cool names like Whiz, bang, pow, action. And so originally Fawcett had two great names in mind, both Thrill Comics and Flash Comics. Neither one of them were available because the ash cans for other companies arrived before their ash cans, so they were forced to change it to Whiz.
In 2012, a near mint copy of Whiz Comics #2 sold for just $281,001, which is really a bargain compared to the highest-selling first appearance of Superman. A near mint copy of Action Comics #1 sold for $3.21 million in 2014. Naturally, Captain Marvel's first adventure was an origin story. And it was a doozy. This superhero wasn't an alien like Superman, and he wasn't a millionaire like Bruce Wayne. Turns out, our hero was really just a kid named Billy Batson.
In Whiz Comics #2, Billy appears to be living on the streets, selling newspapers, trying to make a living.
A stranger lures him into the subway, and the way he's drawn in the C.C. Beck version is he's just all shadow.
And the subway car took him to this mysterious place called the Rock Fraternity.
Billy sees in this long tunnel with these statues of the 7 sins and the wizard at the end with the big block hanging over him.
And this white-haired wizard tells them, you are going to be my new champion in the universe and fight for good and justice.
And of course, the best part comes when Billy says the wizard's name. Shazam! It was Bill Parker who came up with the name Shazam by combining the first letters from the names of 6 legendary heroes. Those would be Solomon for his wisdom, Hercules for strength, Atlas for stamina, Zeus for power, Achilles for courage, and Mercury for speed.
He says Shazam, bam, lightning hits this kid and he don't die. He's reborn as something bigger.
The boy that becomes a superhero is the single most unique aspect of Captain Marvel.
What kid doesn't have that kind of wish and wouldn't want that wish fulfillment?
Lightning comes down, and suddenly he's just standing there, an adult man with adult hands, adult feet. And I think he's just like, what happened?
Shazam speaks to something in all of us that if we rubbed that magic lamp, or if we got that magic word, that we could become a superhero.
It's so cool. You can be saving the day, and when you come back, it's like, Shazam, hey guys, ready for dinner?
He's one of very few superhero characters that is genuinely stoked to be a superhero. More often than not, you've got a character who is begrudgingly like, oh, I have to save the world again. Billy Batson is so excited.
Billy had that optimism of childhood, and Captain Marvel was always very pure, and that was what I liked about him.
The superhero's debut also introduced one of comic book's greatest costumes.
It's one of the best costumes ever because it's simple red, yellow, and white. That lightning bolt is one of the most universal symbols that we have in any culture.
The lightning bolt was the idea of Bill Parker.
It's so iconic that in some ways it's even more iconic than Superman and Batman. Who's the generic go-to symbol on any superhero for anything? The lightning bolt. That is Captain Marvel.
Bill Parker also suggested the captain's unusual cape, modeled after the style of 18th century European soldiers.
He's Captain Marvel, so it makes sense to have some aspect of a military-type costume.
Captain Marvel's debut sold an impressive 500,000 copies, and later sales climbed fast, thanks to the Captain's good guy character, his striking look, and a wild world of adventure that only C.C. Beck could draw.
I love the way he juxtaposed young Billy Batson against Captain Marvel. If you look at Billy Batson with like the little dots for the eyes and stuff, it was a simplification which spoke more to comic strips than comic books. But when you look at Shazam or Captain Marvel, he obviously looked more like a traditional superhero with the way the face was drawn, classically handsome.
Whiz Comics #2 also introduced the evil genius who became our hero's most dogged foe, Dr. Thaddeus Bodog Savannah.
Savannah was there at the very beginning. In that incarnation, he was a thwarted scientist who was aggrieved that the world didn't appreciate him.
Originally, it seemed like Savannah was motivated purely by a hunger for riches and power. But in Whiz Comics number 15, it was revealed that Savannah had once been, get ready for this, a humanitarian who wanted to make the world a better place. And he was driven to evil by giant corporations. Oh, and he was also the first person to figure out that Shazam's secret identity is Billy Batson. Over time, as he was constantly beaten by Captain Marvel, his main motive became revenge against the world's mightiest mortal.
Savannah's way of slandering Captain Marvel was to call him the big red cheese. Savannah is jealous of anybody he's just a lot of inferiority complexes, clearly. C.C. Beck made mention of Dr. Savannah being based on his dentist. So I always thought, what an interesting inspiration for a bad guy.
In 1941, only 1 year after his debut, Captain Marvel made history with a comic book milestone, one that would become a ritual for all major superheroes by the 21st century. Other characters at the time might have become popular toys, but no one had a movie.
Captain Marvel becomes the very first superhero to appear in a movie.
And on March 28, 1941, Episode 1 of the 12-part Adventures of Captain Marvel premiered across America. "24-year-old Frank Coughlin Jr. wasn't exactly the teenaged Billy from the comics. But when it came to Captain Marvel,
Shazam!
Stuntman turned actor Tom Tyler came close to a sketch out of C.C. Beck's brain.
I loved that series. Tom Tyler looks like Captain Marvel. I mean, he was the ideal superhero physically.
He had the military jacket. I mean, the costume looked good. The flying effects they did with stringing up dummies across canyons on wire, which was very effective for a long shot.
They ended up with better flying techniques than the later Superman serial would have, or even really anything else.
The Adventures of Captain Marvel reflected the fun escapism that Depression-era America was hungry for. The series was a smash hit, and it later influenced filmmakers like Steven Spielberg and George Lucas when they tackled the serial-style adventures of Indiana Jones.
Are you ready to tell me?
Yeah. I'll not only tell you how, I'll show you how it's done. Shazam!
By 1942, Captain Marvel was in his prime. Fawcett Publications' Straight Arrow Superstar was now neck and neck in sales with DC Comics' Superman.
These comics rivaled the sales of even Superman in their heyday because they had a magic to them that very few characters have.
The exuberance and the joy, the sheer joy and the humor.
They were whimsical and fun and I think inspirational in a lot of ways. The core message of we all have a superhero in us, we just need the ability to get it out, is really something special.
They were very good at keeping the stories light and for kids, but kind of smart. I mean, they would do surrealistic things that, I read them as an adult and I can't believe it.
You meet a person like Talkie Tawny, a anthropomorphic tiger in a suit.
Talkie Tawny is a tiger who was a real tiger in Africa who in the 40s got his talking ability by magic milk and then walked around wearing a suit. Nobody questions it in the comic. It's just totally normal.
Hoppy, the Marvel Bunny, has its own, like a talking animal universe.
A talking animal universe led by a rabbit from Funny Animalville, who was such a huge fan of Captain Marvel that one day he tried to copy his hero by shouting, Shazam! And bam! He turned into Hoppy, the Marvel Bunny, a fuzzy pink superhero with powers similar to Captain Marvel himself. Just take my word for it, the tongue-in-cheek world of Hoppy was pretty wild.
But As a kid, you don't question it. It all makes sense, and you just want to be part of that family.
Captain Marvel became the backbone, the spine, the heart of so many people's childhoods. That became someone's religion.
Fawcett Publications, recognizing the Superman fan club was a big success, started their own Captain Marvel fan club.
Kids are joining the Captain Marvel fan clubs. They're sending in their dimes. They're getting all these badges back. It's like being in a magic spell. It has that same sense of wonder and awe.
But just as he entered the pop culture stratosphere, Captain Marvel was about to face a foe more powerful than any he'd ever encountered.
Lawyers. Fawcett created this character specifically to cash in on Superman, but then so did a million other characters. But the difference was, whatever Fawcett were doing was working, because their Captain Marvel was a massive threat to DC and to Superman.
DC Comics brought a lawsuit saying Captain Marvel infringes Superman. They're both superheroes, tight clothes, feats of power and strength and speed.
We are here at the DC Comics vault, and really the two biggest Golden Age characters of all time are Superman and Captain Marvel, and you see their very first comic book appearances side by side. You also see one of the reasons why DC decided to sue Fawcett, a lot of similarities between what's happening on these covers.
DC Comics starts off by sending a cease and desist letter to Fawcett Publications, but Captain Marvel was very successful and Fawcett was going to fight it.
7 years would pass before the lawsuit came to court, as World War II slowed the collecting of evidence. In the meantime, Captain Marvel's adventures were selling an astronomical 1.8 million copies per issue. To put that in perspective, that's nearly 20 times the amount of what's considered a blockbuster today. To feed demand, Fawcett gave the world's mightiest mortals some friends and family. They became almost as beloved as the big guy himself. And they included one co-star who was among the very first superheroes to have a disability.
Freddie Freeman, he's Captain Marvel Jr., and he's Billy's best friend.
Freddie lives with a disability, and he walks with a crutch, like, for his whole life. Yeah, he gets bullied for it, but he doesn't really let it affect him.
During an adventure, Captain Marvel siphons off his powers and gives it to Freddie, whose magic word is Captain Marvel, because that's where his powers come from, not Shazam. And Freddie becomes a really huge star.
He was flashier than the Captain. He stayed young when he became superpowered. He was the guy Elvis modeled himself after.
The king of rock and roll became fascinated with Captain Marvel Jr. in the late 1940s. For Elvis, who grew up in poverty, Captain Marvel Jr. represented escape. He later said that reading the comics made him picture himself as a hero.
Elvis Presley is said to have based both his hair design and also his 1970s cape and costumes after Captain Marvel Jr.
And today, visitors to Graceland can see a tribute from the king to his favorite comic book character. Even bigger than Freddie was a female addition to the franchise, Mary Marvel, who in 1942 was revealed to be Billy Batson's long-lost twin sister.
Billy starts out on the street, no family. Mary was an important component of pulling Billy through this story, learning he has a sister.
I love Mary. She was the first female superhero that had their own comic.
She predated Supergirl. She predated Batgirl. She was I don't know if she was the prototype for them, but she was certainly in that realm.
These are Mary Marvel comics from the 1940s, and if you can't tell, she is based originally on Judy Garland. If you don't like Judy Garland, well, forget you.
Mary just turned out to be this bright, snappy character that was a lot of fun to draw and write.
Mary also got her powers from the wizard Shazam.
So she says the word Shazam, but it's a total different pantheon of gods.
And for the record, those gods were Selene for grace, Hippolyta for strength, Ariadne for skill, Zephyrus for fleetness and flight, Aurora for beauty, and Minerva for wisdom. By 1945, readers were following the adventures of an entire Marvel family.
The Marvel family had Uncle Dudley, who was Uncle Marvel, who really didn't have any powers at all. Nobody questioned it.
What's so special is the Marvel family, this bond between this orphan Billy Batson and surrogate brothers and sisters and aunts and uncles, a family of superheroes.
What began as a single family of superheroes soon spread across the entire world of comics, beginning a tradition that's lasted ever since.
Ultimately, we ended up with the Superman family of books, but Captain Marvel got there first.
The first issue of Marvel Family Comics also introduced a villain, one who's become Shazam's greatest foe.
Black Adam! Black Adam is his true counterpart and his predecessor in a way.
He was originally the dark version of Captain Marvel.
Black Adam was the first experiment of the wizard Shazam to try to lessen his burden. He transferred some of his power to Adam, and that power corrupted him.
Black Adam shows what happens when you give a normal man that much power.
And that was why Billy's important, because he's a child. And yeah, he could have been corrupted, but I think a good kid is going to do good.
While Savannah might be considered the Luthor to Shazam's Superman, Black Adam was the Joker to his Batman. Captain Marvel comics were unlike any other, and none of his stories were more bizarre or more popular than the 1943 classic, The Monster Society of Evil.
In the 1940s, most comic book stories were one single adventure. But early on, Captain Marvel starts changing that. And when you get to Otto Binder and C.C. Beck's Monster Society of Evil, you are off the charts. It's a storyline that goes on for over 2 years.
Shazam battled a team of supervillains, armies, and entire alien species as they attempted to conquer the Earth. They were all following orders from the ultimate villain, but it took a long time for readers to find out just who that was.
Cece told me he had no idea who the villain was until like 16 issues into it or something. And they decided, okay, let's make it a worm.
To be exact, the ultimate mastermind of the Monster Society was Mr. Mind, a tiny worm who dictated his evil commands through a voice box. Nobody saw that coming.
It's cool to have a little worm with a little radio box talking about how he's going to rule the world.
You'd think that a worm would be kind of boring as a villain, and yet I have more talent wanting to write Mr. Mind into their stories than any member of the Shazam family.
By 1948, Captain Marvel had it all. But just as he reached the peak of his success, well, remember that lawsuit? Yep. After 7 years of collecting evidence, the case of Fawcett versus DC finally went to court. And that's when the real battle of the superheroes began.
Mr. Beck, what do you say as to whether or not at the time you prepared this Captain Marvel panel you had ever seen the Superman panel?
If this panel was on that one page that I recall, then I had seen it. And if not, I never saw it.
Then you got disgusted with it. You are not interested anymore?
I had no interest in reading it. It's not a thing that an adult would read. And somehow or another, there's not enough attention-gathering pictures in there to make me want to read it.
Did anybody warn you not to read the Superman comics?
Only the kids. They said it was a waste of time.
And then there's Maxwell Elkan, who worked alongside Beck at Fawcett. He didn't exactly support Beck's testimony.
He seemed mostly interested in Superman books. There were comic books on his desk and Superman books around.
Fawcett employees gave their sources for their superhero, wearing tights and things like that from Errol Flynn and Robin Hood, from Greek athletes. You know, basically some of the same inspiration for Superman was the same inspiration for Captain Marvel.
DC produced a 150-page document of what they said were cases where Captain Marvel had clearly ripped off Superman, but the staff at Fawcett were able to show Captain Marvel had flown long before Superman had flown, that a character like Popeye had super strength before Superman or Captain Marvel did.
Finally, in 1948, the court reached a verdict. And at first, things looked pretty simple.
The court looked at all the evidence and basically said, there's clear copying here, so DC would think they're gonna win.
End of story, right? Wrong. Because to DC's amazement, the court ruled in favor of Fawcett Publications.
The district court held that DC Comics had lost its copyright because they had licensed Superman newspaper syndication rights to a company named McClure. And McClure had failed to properly include a copyright notice on the licensed Superman comic strips. They didn't technically comply with the copyright laws.
In other words, the court said, yeah, Captain Marvel copied Superman, but it didn't matter because Superman was out of copyright. The first round went to Fawcett. But DC Comics wasn't ready to throw in the towel, and they quickly appealed the verdict. Let's hear a little testimony from legendary DC editor Whitney Ellsworth.
In Action Comics number 6 in 1938, we have this scene of Superman pulling up the elevator by a cable. And we go over to the Captain Marvel shot in Whiz number 2, and we see practically the identical action being portrayed.
Okay, maybe Ellsworth had a point there, but not so fast. Here's what the Captain's co-creator Bill Parker had to say.
Mr. Parker, you had the Captain pulling an elevator up?
That is right. At the time, I had lived in a hotel on Fifth Avenue, where the elevator was operated by a cable. And I was impressed that when you pulled the cable, you were actually pulling the elevator up. And the elevator operator used to let me operate it.
I'm not sure that really helped their case. Well, in 1953, 12 long years after it began, a final court decision was reached.
The appellate court held that DC did not lose its copyright in Superman because DC Comics had included copyright notice on all of its own publications.
So, DC proved that it still owns Superman, and that it always owned Superman. And in the opinion of the court, Captain Marvel had copied him. Now here's the heartbreaker. By the time the lawsuit ended, it almost didn't matter anymore, because readers were losing interest in the world's mightiest mortal.
Lots of people were getting out of the business. The heat was on from the censorship movement attacking comic books.
Fawcett just basically saw the comic market was dying at that time in the 50s, and they gave up because they didn't want to keep paying legal fees.
Fawcett agreed to pay DC Comics $400,000 in damages. That's nearly $4 million today. Worst of all, for the fans still around, Fawcett agreed to stop publishing all Captain Marvel comics. So in 1953, Billy, Freddie, Mary, and the rest of the Shazam gang disappeared from magazine racks, seemingly never to return. But even as the Captain and his family faded from view, one powerful word stayed behind as a fixture in pop culture.
The word Shazam was still in the zeitgeist. It still is to this day.
It was almost like their cup overfloweth when they created that character. Not only did they create some magic, but they created a magic word out of nowhere that has transcended the medium.
But not even the word Shazam could bring back Captain Marvel himself. Or so it seemed, until 1972. In a time of political protests, Vietnam and Watergate, DC took a step that no one expected. They brought the sleeping superhero out of retirement.
DC was looking to expand their library of superheroes. Superheroes were returning. They went to Fawcett Publications, who still owned all the underlying rights to Captain Marvel, but couldn't use those rights. So Fawcett licensed those rights to DC.
That's right. Having lost their lawsuit with DC Comics, Fawcett licensed the rights to a character they created but couldn't use to the company that sued them in the first place. And DC even hired back CC Beck to draw him.
And so for the character to finally land, so to speak, at DC was oddly poetic and very ironic, all things considered.
Just when you thought the story couldn't get any more complicated, in the years since 1953, the name Captain Marvel had fallen out of trademark.
DC or Fawcett hadn't used Captain Marvel for 14 years. And under trademark law, they would consider that abandoning your trademark. So Marvel Comics filed for a trademark registration for the name Captain Marvel and started publishing Captain Marvel comic books.
So DC couldn't put the name Captain Marvel on the comic book because that belonged to the Marvel character. Well, the most popular part of the Captain Marvel comic books was the magic word Shazam. And DC is like, we'll put that on the comic. So the very first title is Shazam, featuring the original Captain Marvel.
Marvel agreed that DC could continue to use Captain Marvel as the name of the character in the internal storylines, but you can't use Captain Marvel as the title of the book.
So, Shazam was back. And to explain his almost two-decade absence, well, the nefarious Dr. Sivana had put all the characters in suspended animation. A common reason given for why characters had fallen out of publication. Joining CC Beck for Shazam's return was a team of rising comic book rock stars. Among them was 22-year-old Elliot S. Maggin.
Well, I had been writing Superman, and Carmine Infantino thought it would be a cool thing if somebody was writing Superman and was also writing Captain Marvel, just because of the confluence of weirdness in there. Denny O'Neil had written the first book, and I guess I was on the second. We were doing the 50s Captain Marvel because CC Beck was doing the art. And DC, he was very sure of himself. He would do whatever he wanted to do. Even if the editor changed something, he could change it back.
CC Beck was very proud of being a cartoonist. And what he tried to do was simplify his art. Every time he drew an image, he would redraw it simpler and simpler just to get to the basic elements. And when you add that vibrant golden age color, these things just pop, and they're accessible, and you can get lost in these worlds.
People used to say his artwork was primitive or old style or something. I said, no, it's restrained.
Putting the world's mightiest mortal under the DC banner instantly made him one of the most powerful heroes in the DC universe. But that didn't mean he was one of the most popular. The choice to keep the character totally in the style of the 1950s pleased die-hard fans. But it also meant the beloved superhero had a hard time finding a modern audience during the politically charged 1970s.
The art style didn't change. It was very much in tone and in line with what it was beforehand. And for me, it was completely out of step with what I was reading. So I pretty much read that first issue, and I didn't pick up the second.
Not long after his comic book relaunch, Shazam found a bigger following on television. In 1974, the superhero was back in live-action form as a hit Saturday morning kids series starring Jackson Bostwick.
It was kind of nuts. It was a teenager and an old man who drove around in a Winnebago and got people out of jams by becoming a god. It's like he really underused those powers, but you didn't care because there he was in the suit. There he was saying Shazam.
I definitely watched Shazam. I don't think people really understand how little of this content existed outside the world of the pages of the comic books. So if there was any sort of live action or animation production, you had to see it.
As a comic book kid, you felt representation. You were like, finally, like, I know this character. And as a child, I was like, this must cost millions, you know, because it wasn't a cartoon.
By the late 1970s, Shazam was also creating a storm in his own animated TV series. And unlike its live-action cousin, the cartoon series drew heavily from classic comic book lore.
They actually, I thought, were pretty good. I remember loving the Black Adam ones.
They referenced in the opening, like, Billy Batson talks to the elders. It was a time when we didn't have better or know that we could ever have better.
And when you hear that original sound, or you see those original images, you realize he's the root of so much stuff that came afterwards.
In 1978, the success of the big screen blockbuster, Superman the Movie, inspired DC Comics to pair off two classic characters for the first time.
We were looking forward to the upcoming Superman movie starring Christopher Reeve, and we were hoping that readers would be interested in a story that featured Superman versus Captain Marvel. The book was kind of a meta commentary on that conflict between the two. You had them in conflict for what amounted to false reasons. I mean, they were being fooled into being enemies of each other.
I love those confrontations because we all know that one of Superman's weaknesses is magic.
Kryptonite, as we all know famously, but maybe something most cats don't know, is that Superman's also felled by magic. So it's Kryptonite, the one that is marketed well. Kryptonite has the best publicist, but you could take out Superman with magic.
You couldn't have planned a better rival to Superman.
In the comics, both superheroes turned out to be winners, as they put their differences aside to team up and defeat Black Adam. But Shazam had a tougher time fitting in with the overall vibe of the gritty 1980s, because things were pretty dark.
The hardest part about Shazam and his world is that it's so different than the DC concepts.
People had a hard time wrapping their heads around the tone of it. They didn't really understand it's got to be kind of fun and whimsical and magical.
DC set out to give Shazam a more modern style. He made occasional appearances in comics alongside Superman, the Justice League, and DC's All-Star Squadron. Until finally, the entire Marvel family was brought into the larger DC universe in the 1985 multiverse epic, Crisis on Infinite Earths. In this ambitious crossover event, DC ingeniously synchronized all the different timelines and versions of its characters. It did it by putting them all into a single universe. A universe in which only one version of each iconic hero or villain remained. And with that, DC thrust Captain Marvel in the middle of a story filled with peril and dire consequences. One where many of the world's most beloved heroes did not escape alive. The massive success of that 12-issue series allowed DC to take Captain Marvel in an even more serious direction. 1987's Shazam: The New Beginning reflected a more realistic take on the character, as written by Roy Thomas and drawn by a team that included Tom Mandrake.
This was going to be the first time that Captain Marvel appeared as a more serious character. And certainly as a Captain Marvel fan, it was kind of a surprise to me that we were going to be doing this, but I just went with it. I took the same riffs that I was using in Batman, the same kind of lighting effects, with a slightly lighter edge, but very much the same kind of art direction. When I was a boy, my dad was a comic book fan anyway, so we used to go back and forth about who is better, Captain Marvel or Superman. I was in the Superman camp, and he was in the Captain Marvel camp. He was a C.C. Beck man all the way. So when he found out that we were making Captain Marvel more serious, he didn't think that was that great. He thought it was a bad idea, but he was always supportive of me, so he was like, okay, you do that. My work was always more heavily shadowed, more film noir. And that was another reason I was surprised that I was suddenly doing Captain Marvel. I wanted to get that feeling of that boy's face in there. That is the challenge for that character. You've got a great big superhero body with a child's mind in it, which I find endlessly fascinating.
Each writer and artist might have interpreted Billy's transformation differently, but one aspect remained a constant. When Billy transformed into Captain Marvel, he became the best, most powerful version of himself.
There was always this kind of dichotomy. How do you treat Billy Batson as Shazam? Is he transformed in some way into a totally different person, or does he remain Billy Batson? And if he is, in fact, Billy Batson, then he's a kid in a man's body, which is rather awesome. You know, especially if you're a kid and reading a comic book, you'd like to imagine yourself to actually be that superhero.
Which brings us to the 1990s. After decades of adversity, Shazam was back and better than ever. In 1991, DC Comics acquired all rights to the Marvel family, as opposed to licensing the characters from Fawcett Publications.
DC said, let's just buy the rights outright from Fawcett and never have to continue to account to them. And in 1991, the Marvel family became the property of DC Comics.
Finally, the powers of Shazam could be fully unleashed. And that paved the way for a new graphic novel written and drawn by the great Jerry Ordway.
I said, what if we did this as if it were the adaptation of a Shazam movie? So that was the approach. The Republic serial became kind of our touchstone. Indiana Jones, Rocketeer, that was the tone we wanted to go for in the book. Billy Batson's father, who had never been named before, I made it C.C. Batson, a tribute also to C.C. Beck.
The Power of Shazam retold the character's origin story by having Billy's parents ruthlessly killed by their partner, Theo Adam, a version of Black Adam, while the Batsons were on an archaeological dig financed by the Savannah Corporation.
Every aspect of that story comes out of this loss of family and wanting to rebuild it. That was how I always looked at it.
I love the Power of Shazam that Jerry Ordway did. In the original 40s version, when Billy's first drawn down into the subway, he follows a stranger. I always thought that was a little weird. Why would a kid follow someone he didn't know into an abandoned subway? Well, Jerry Ordway introduced the idea that maybe that might have been Billy's dead father helping him along on this path.
The graphic novel led to a long-running comic book series, one that inspired Jerry Ordway and his collaborators to reimagine classic characters from Fawcett Comics in a modern DC universe.
I love Jerry's stuff, and I thought he did a great job of reintroducing all of Captain Marvel's secondary characters, so I love that series.
The Power of Shazam ran an impressive 47 issues through 1999, and it would pave the way for other innovative takes on the character as a new century began. During the early 2000s, many top talents put their own spin on the story of Shazam. Judd Winnick and Howard Porter's The Trials of Shazam offered the twist of having Billy give up his powers for a greater good. As a result, Freddie Freeman loses his powers as well, and he can only reclaim them after passing tests created by the gods themselves. Among the most emotional retellings of the character was Shazam, Power of Hope, by Paul Dini and acclaimed artist Alex Ross. It followed Billy and Captain Marvel as they discover, and are awed by, the real-life heroism they find at a local children's hospital.
I love that story. I love the way he draws Captain Marvel.
Alex Ross has a very photorealistic, painterly style, and he always brought in real-life models to really kind of make it as authentic as possible to traditional portrait painting.
If you want a character to seem larger than life and mythical, you let Alex Ross draw your cover. And when he had a chance to do Captain Marvel, you saw it all over again. That's it. That Shazam is my guy.
I think the character supports all these different takes because it's high concept and it plays to the young reader and the older, more nostalgic adult reader.
In 2007, Jeff Smith, creator of the hit independent comic Bone, put a fresh 21st century take on one of Shazam's most famous adventures, the Monster Society of Evil.
We were very fresh from the 9/11 attacks, and we were very absorbed with terrorism and the Homeland Security. So I thought, well, I'll just have Dr. Savannah be the Attorney General. It allowed me to play into some of the angst that was in the air. You know, Captain Marvel came from that era when punching Nazis on the cover of comics was helpful for all of us to see. And I thought maybe this is kind of the same moment. When DC offered me Shazam, I told my mother, and she actually let out like a little squeal, almost like I had just said the Beatles are coming over or something. And I didn't know she'd ever even read any comics, but she then told me that it was her favorite comic, and this was the key for me. She said when her older sister used to tickle her, kind of, you know, mean but not mean, but she would say Shazam, and then she wouldn't be ticklish. And I went, aha, wait a minute, I think I see what the magic is here. And a little kid can have this magic word, and they're invulnerable.
Which brings us to 2011. Enter the New 52, a relaunch of the whole DC universe, and a new take on the world's mightiest mortal, one that emerged from the genius of artist Gary Frank and writer Jeff Johns.
I tried to introduce a new version of Billy that was still a hero at heart, even though he's kind of defensive because of what life's done to him. He's got to learn to open up to the world again.
He starts off in a pretty bad place where he's not a very likable person, gets this power and then realizes that there's this responsibility and that it changes his life for the better.
I wanted to take what to me was the cornerstone of what Shazam's all about, the Marvel family. And I wanted to expand that family, and not literally through bloodlines, because I thought the whole point of a foster kid is to become part of a new family. So he's in a very diverse group home with different personalities and characters. We created Eugene Choi and Darla Dudley and Pedro Pena. And I wanted the entire arc of it to really be a kid who learns to open himself up to a family again.
And that group of foster kids became a perfect modern-day update of the classic Shazam family.
I like that as my central focus for the book, and then adding magic on top of that and superheroes on top of that.
With the New 52, the superhero also gained a striking new detail to his costume.
Having the hood was kind of a visual example of us trying to lean more towards magic, so we could look a little bit wizardy and not look just like another superhero out there. What I wanted to do with Gary was, when we reintroduced the Rock of Eternity, once it was this massive castle-like magical place where people paid pilgrimage, and then when magic was kind of shut down from this realm, it was hidden. It's a magical place that these kids are going to be able to explore.
To avoid confusion with the Marvel Comics character, the Captain would now be known by a new name. In fact, by a single word: Shazam!
It felt more appropriate to name him Shazam. It feels more magic-y too.
Calling it Shazam, which is what everybody thinks that character's called anyway. Smart.
Jeff Johns' vision of Shazam was so successful, it catapulted the character back into the pop culture mainstream. It also inspired an epic new chapter, starting with a return to the big screen. In 2019, Shazam was finally headed back to movie theaters. This Shazam would be the culmination of over 7 decades of comics, TV shows, cartoons, films, toys, merchandise, video games, and other tellings of his tale.
Say my name so my powers may flow through you.
Shazam? Using 2012's New 52 story by Jeff Johns and Gary Frank as inspiration, the movie would combine comedy and heart to explore the importance of family, connecting with others, and the timeless concept of wish fulfillment.
Having the exuberance and the joy, the sheer joy and the humor of kids with superpowers was paramount to the story.
That's crazy, right?
What are your superpowers?
Superpowers, dude? I don't even know how to pee in this thing.
Every kid wants to be a superhero. And so I think kids will relate to that.
It's big. It's the superhero version of big.
This isn't about him trying to stop the bad guy or learn about these powers or get the girl. This is really about a kid trying to find his family and looking for his place.
Shazam!
The casting was super important because you want someone who can feel like a kid in a grown-up's body.
I can't even believe that we get to be a part of bringing this particular character to life, because it's...
So what kid doesn't want to be a superhero?
Exactly. What adult doesn't want to be a superhero?
What person or kid doesn't want to be a superhero?
I'm still waiting. I mean, I get to do that on camera, but in real life, I'm still waiting.
This means Billy!
I think we both get a lot of fun stuff to do in the movie, but I will concede that, you know, I get to wear the spandex.
You're like a bad guy, right?
The badass Savannah that I play is a scientist's version of what a badass would look like. So he's based on Jeff Johns' incarnation. If he is truly going to be a threat, he's got to be nasty. He's got to be as scary as Shazam is powerful. So we just made him like a heat-seeking, ballistic piece of evil.
And how's this for coincidence? It was announced that a Marvel Studios movie featuring their Captain Marvel would open just 1 month before DC's movie Shazam. What are the odds of that? Every day, around the globe, the world's mightiest mortal continues to be a towering touchstone for generations of fans, whether it's in the pages of the comics or the magical glow of a movie screen. And that fan club is only getting bigger.
Are you guys ready for some Shazam?
The concept of a kid getting the powers of gods Those are great wish fulfillment things. I don't think anybody ever loses that.
Ever since I was a very little girl, always been a Shazam fan. I think he captures the essence of being a 14-year-old perfectly.
The Romans had Jupiter, and the Greeks had Zeus, and the Norse had Thor and Odin, and we've got Captain Marvel and Superman and Batman. Those are our guys.
Look how long he's lasted, and now look how often it's copied. Throw a rock and you will hit a comic now in which the kid is the protagonist.
The idea that a person that powerful could still be at heart a little boy, the idea that all of us could become a champion, resonates today.
There is nothing compared to like watching a kid light up for the first time, watching their imagination take off when they see Shazam. When you watch a kid comprehend, like, wait, so this kid, he becomes the superhero? Wow, like that's beautiful.
In 2018, DC launched a new Shazam series by Jeff Johns and artist Dale Eaglesham that delivers more mythology, more mystery, and more magic to a whole new generation. But whatever the decade, whatever the era, Shazam will always be a hero who's really just a kid at heart. And that's something all of us can relate to. He's the best example of pure, okay, I'll just say it, goodness. Because as Billy Batson himself can tell you, it just takes a little magic, not to mention kindness and compassion, to bring out the hero in all of us.
It's magic. And any kid can be like, I want to be a member of the Shazam family. All they gotta do is shout,
Shazam!
You should do like an edit, and then it should be Zach.
Yeah.